The record appeared on Celia Winthrop's screen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Flagged automatically by the new digital migration software the library had been installing for the better part of a month. A single title, checked out continuously, without a single day's interruption, for 11,315 days. 31 years. Celia stared at the number for a long moment, assuming, initially, some kind of data entry error carried over from the library's old paper and microfiche system, a glitch in the decades of accumulated records now being converted, book by book, patron by patron, into a modern database. But the borrower's name appeared correctly formatted, the renewal history behind it fully intact, a continuous, unbroken chain of monthly renewals, each one logged by a different staff member across 3 decades, each one paid promptly, on time, without a single late fee or lapse. Whitcombe, Arthur. Title: The Lighthouse at Millbrook Point. Status: renewed continuously since March, 31 years ago. Celia pulled up the library's new patron database policy, freshly circulated by the incoming director the previous month as part of the modernization effort. Any account showing a continuous loan beyond 5 years would be automatically converted, under the new system, to a lost book billing status, the outstanding item charged at current replacement value. The account then closed. The policy, Celia understood, was meant to clean up decades of exactly this kind of administrative loose thread, tidying the library's records into something efficient and current. She had 2 months, according to the rollout schedule, before every account like Arthur Whitcomb's would be automatically converted and closed by the new system, with no human review at all. She could have sent a form letter. The policy technically permitted it. A standardized notice explaining the billing change, giving patrons 30 days to either return the item or accept the replacement charge. Dozens of similar accounts were already being processed exactly that way, quietly, efficiently, without any particular attention paid to the specific, individual stories that might explain why any given book had remained, decade after decade, in continuous circulation with a single patron. Something about the specific number, 31 years, unbroken, never once late, made Celia hesitate before drafting the standard letter. She looked up Arthur Whitcomb's address instead, printed out his full renewal history, and drove to his house that evening, uncertain exactly what she expected to find, only understanding, with a clarity she couldn't fully explain even to herself, that this particular account deserved more than an automated notice. She stood on his front porch for a moment before knocking, the printed pages in her hand, and when an elderly man answered the door, steady-eyed, careful in his movements, regarding her with a polite, cautious curiosity, Celia found herself, for a moment, uncertain how to begin explaining why a librarian she had never met was standing on his doorstep at 7 in the evening, holding 31 years of his own quiet history in her hands. Celia Winthrop was 36 years old, an assistant librarian at the small public library where she had worked for nearly a decade, drawn to the profession originally by a specific, orderly satisfaction in cataloging and preserving, the careful, methodical work of ensuring that nothing important ever simply disappeared through neglect or disorganization. Her mother had died 2 years earlier, a sudden cardiac event that had given the family no meaningful warning and no real time to prepare. Celia had managed the practical aftermath with the same careful, methodical competence she brought to her professional life. The arrangements, the estate paperwork, the slow administrative unwinding of a life into documents and decisions. What she had not yet managed, in the 2 years since, was the considerably harder work of actually going through her mother's remaining personal belongings, boxes of clothing, photographs, letters, and ordinary household objects that Celia had packed hastily in the immediate aftermath of the funeral and stacked in her own garage, where they remained entirely untouched 2 years later. She told herself, when she thought about the boxes at all, that she simply hadn't found the time an explanation that held up reasonably well on any given ordinary week, though considerably less well across the accumulated span of 24 months. Her closest friend, Denise, had gently suggested more than once that Celia might benefit from finally working through the boxes, perhaps with support, rather than allowing them to remain a permanent, unexamined fixture of her garage. Celia had generally agreed, in the moment, that this was probably good advice, and had done nothing further to act on it. She was recently divorced, an amicable, unremarkable ending to a 6-year marriage that had simply run its course without any particular drama, leaving Celia with a specific, settled solitude she had grown to appreciate more than she'd initially expected to. Arthur Whitcombe's name had appeared on the library's paper renewal slips for as long as Celia had worked there, though she had never once, in nearly a decade of employment, actually met him in person. He renewed by mail for most of that time, and more recently by phone, an elderly patron whose consistent, courteous punctuality had become, without anyone particularly remarking on it, simply one of the library's quiet, unremarkable fixtures, the way certain patrons become familiar through their patterns alone, long before anyone learns their actual face. Celia had not expected, standing on Arthur's front porch with a printed loan history in her hand, that the routine administrative task of closing out an unusually long-standing account would become anything more than a brief, slightly awkward conversation. She had not yet understood how directly her own 2 years of carefully avoided grief were about to be confronted by the shape of a man who had spent 3 full decades finding his own particular, dignified way of refusing to let something important simply disappear. Arthur Whitcombe invited Celia inside once she explained, as gently as she could manage, the reason for her visit: the library's new digitization policy, the automatic billing system that would activate in 2 months, the specific accounts, his included, that would be affected. His home was modest, orderly, lined with bookshelves in nearly every room, the particular arrangement of someone who had spent a lifetime valuing careful, patient organization. He listened to Celia's explanation without visible alarm, nodding slowly, understanding immediately the practical shape of what she was describing. "I always wondered how long the old system would let this continue," he said, once she'd finished. "I think I assumed, at some point, someone would eventually notice and ask me to explain myself. I'm not sure I ever expected it to take quite this long." "I don't need you to explain yourself," Celia said carefully. "I just need to understand what you'd like to do, whether you'd like to return the book or purchase a replacement copy to close out the account properly, or some other arrangement. I came in person because 31 years felt like it deserved more than a form letter." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, looking at the printed pages Celia still held, the specific weight of 3 decades worth of dates and renewals laid out in flat, orderly rows. "I think I'd like to tell you why, if you have the time," he said finally. "I don't think I've ever actually explained it to anyone at the library. I don't think anyone ever asked directly enough for me to feel it was appropriate to volunteer." Celia sat down across from him, setting the papers aside. "I had a son," Arthur said, his voice steady but carrying a weight Celia recognized immediately as long carried rather than freshly surfacing. "Miles. He would be 41 now, if he'd lived. He died when he was 8 years old. Leukemia, diagnosed too late for the treatments available at the time to do much good. He was sick for about 14 months before he passed." Celia sat very still, understanding, with a specific ache, the general shape of where this story was heading even before Arthur continued. "We read together every night, the whole time he was sick," Arthur said. "It was the one part of each day that stayed reliably good, even during the worst stretches of the treatment. He'd checked that particular book out himself, a few weeks before his diagnosis, a children's story about a lighthouse keeper. Nothing especially remarkable as literature, but he loved it, wanted it read to him again and again, and by the time he was too sick to return it himself, it had simply become part of our nightly routine. I kept renewing it on his behalf while he was in the hospital, thinking at the time that we'd return it together once he was well enough. He never got the chance to return it himself, Celia said quietly. Arthur shook his head slowly, his eyes bright now, though his voice remained steady. No, he died in March, 31 years ago. I renewed the book again that same month, out of pure habit, I think, not even fully registering what I was doing. And then the next month came, and I renewed it again, and I think, somewhere in that first year, it stopped being about accidental habit and became something more deliberate. I couldn't bring myself to return it. It was the last object we'd shared together in that specific, ordinary way, and giving it back felt like giving up the final physical thread connecting me to those nightly readings. But I also couldn't bring myself to simply keep it dishonestly, without paying, without maintaining the actual, legitimate arrangement the library expected. So I kept renewing it, properly, on time, every single month, for 31 years, because it felt like the one way I could keep faith with both things at once, keeping him close, and still being the kind of honest person he was being raised to become. Celia drove home that evening with Arthur's story sitting heavily in her chest, understanding, with growing clarity, that the library's new automated policy, however reasonable in its broader intent, was about to convert 31 years of a father's careful, dignified grief into a flat, impersonal, lost book charge, closing the account with the same indifferent efficiency it applied to every other overdue title in the system. She raised the issue with the library's new director, Patricia Hume, the following morning, explaining Arthur's situation in careful detail, hoping to find some flexibility within the new policy's implementation. Patricia listened with genuine sympathy, though her response carried the specific practical constraints of someone managing an institution rather than an individual relationship. I understand why this feels significant, she said, but I can't simply make exceptions library-wide based on individual stories, however moving they are. If we bend the policy for one patron, we'll need a process for evaluating every similar case, and I don't have the staff capacity to individually investigate 3 decades of loan history for every long-standing account in this system. What if there's another option? Celia asked. Something that closes the account properly, satisfies the policy, but doesn't just erase what this actually represents. Patricia considered this. I'm open to alternatives, she said, but it would need to be something structured, something we could apply consistently if other similar situations come up. I don't want this to become an exception we can't defend if someone else asks why their account got special treatment and Mr. Whitcomb's did. Celia spent the following several days turning the problem over, distracted enough by it that she found herself, on a Thursday evening, standing in her own garage, looking at the stack of untouched boxes she'd been avoiding for 2 years, understanding with an uncomfortable clarity the specific parallel she'd been circling without quite naming directly. She called Denise that evening, describing Arthur's situation, and found herself, partway through the conversation, admitting something she hadn't previously said aloud even to herself. I think I understand exactly why he couldn't return that book, she said. I have 2 years of my mother's things sitting in boxes I haven't opened, because opening them means actually deciding what to keep and what to let go of, and as long as they stay sealed, I don't have to make that decision at all. I think I've been doing my own quieter version of what he's been doing for 31 years. Have you thought about finally going through them? Denise asked gently. I think I have to, Celia said. I think watching what's happening with Arthur's book is making it very hard to keep pretending my boxes are just an ordinary, temporary inconvenience, instead of something I've been actively avoiding. She began, that same weekend, the slow work of finally opening the boxes in her garage, not rushing, not forcing herself through all of them at once, but starting, deliberately, with the first one, understanding that the specific fear beneath her avoidance had never really been about the physical clutter, but about the finality of deciding, object by object, what deserved to be kept and what could finally, safely, be released. Celia returned to Arthur's house the following week with a proposal she had developed carefully, in consultation with Patricia, over several days of conversation. "I'd like to suggest something," she told Arthur, sitting again in his quiet, book-lined living room. "The library has a small local history and memorial collection, donated items with significant community history attached to them, items we preserve permanently rather than circulate. It's not something we publicize widely, but it exists, and I think this book belongs there more than it belongs in ordinary circulation or in a lost book billing file that just erases 31 years of what it's actually represented." Arthur looked at her with careful, cautious interest. "What would that mean practically?" "You'd formally donate the book to the library," Celia said. "It would be preserved permanently in a protected collection, with a small note acknowledging its history. Not necessarily every detail, only what you're comfortable sharing, even just Miles's name and the dates, if that's what feels right. It would mean the book is no longer something you personally hold and renew each month, but it would also mean it's protected forever, instead of remaining something only you are responsible for keeping safe, which I understand might feel like a difficult thing to consider, given how long you've carried that responsibility alone." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, and Celia understood, watching his expression, that she was asking him to consider something considerably larger than a simple administrative transaction, a genuine, deliberate surrender of 31 years of careful, private stewardship, trading the specific comfort of personal possession for the different, less immediate comfort of institutional permanence. "Could I see it once more first?" Arthur asked finally. "Properly, before I decide anything." "Of course," Celia said. "I could bring it to you, or you're welcome to come by the library, whichever feels easier." Arthur chose to come to the library himself the following afternoon, and Celia retrieved the book from its shelf, worn, its spine soft with decades of careful handling, the cover illustration faded but still recognizable, a small lighthouse standing against a painted sea. They sat together at a small table near the reading room's window, and Arthur opened the book slowly, turning its pages with the specific, careful reverence of someone handling something considerably more significant than its physical form suggested. "Here," he said, pointing to a small margin note on the 14th page, a child's uneven handwriting beside an illustration of a small fishing boat. "Miles drew this. He always wanted to draw the boats himself. Said the illustrator hadn't gotten them quite right." A few pages later, another small addition, a crooked star drawn beside a passage describing the lighthouse's beam sweeping across a night sky. He'd add a star every time the lighthouse lit up in the story. Said it needed more stars than the picture showed. Celia looked through the pages with him, watching Arthur's face move through decades of memory with each small, careful mark his son had left behind. Evidence of a boy who had been sick and frightened and dying, and who had, despite all of that, still found room, night after night, for small acts of ordinary childhood creativity and opinion. "I think," Arthur said finally, closing the book gently, "that keeping this in a drawer at my own house, where I'm the only person who ever sees it, was never really protecting it properly. I think I've just been afraid, for 31 years, that letting anyone else see it meant letting go of him a little more completely. I don't think that's actually true anymore. I think I'd like it to be somewhere safe, somewhere it outlasts me, instead of just disappearing into an estate sale someday, sold off with the rest of my belongings by people who'll have no idea what any of it actually meant." Arthur formally donated the book to the library's memorial collection 3 weeks later, in a small, quiet ceremony that Celia arranged specifically without any of the impersonal efficiency the new digitization policy had originally threatened to apply to his account. Patricia attended, along with a handful of library staff, and Celia had prepared a small brass plaque, worded carefully in consultation with Arthur himself, to accompany the book in its new permanent display case. "The Lighthouse at Millbrook Point. Read nightly to Miles Whitcombe during the final year of his life. Donated by his father Arthur after 31 years of faithful renewal, in loving memory. Arthur stood before the display case for a long moment after the small ceremony concluded, the book now resting inside protective glass, its worn cover and Miles's small, careful marginalia preserved exactly as they had always been, no longer requiring Arthur's own monthly vigilance to remain safe. "I think this is what I actually wanted, all along," he told Celia quietly, standing together before the case. "Not to keep it hidden away, just for myself. To know it would be looked after properly by people who understood what it meant, long after I'm no longer able to look after it myself." Celia finished going through her mother's boxes over the following month, working through them steadily, a few each week rather than all at once, keeping a carefully chosen handful of objects, a small collection of photographs, a favorite scarf, a stack of letters her mother had written to Celia's father during a brief separation early in their marriage, since reconciled, and donating or releasing the remainder, understanding, with each box she finished, that letting go of the physical objects did not require letting go of what they had represented. She kept the letters in a small box on her own bookshelf, not hidden away in a garage, but present, visible, part of the ordinary architecture of her daily life, rather than something she needed to carefully avoid looking at directly. "I think I understand something now that I didn't before all of this happened," she told Denise over dinner one evening, several weeks after Arthur's donation ceremony. "I think I was treating the boxes the same way Arthur was treating the book, believing that keeping something sealed away, untouched, was the same thing as protecting it. I don't think that's actually true. I think real protection means actually looking at what you're keeping, deciding deliberately what matters most, and finding it somewhere safe and present, instead of just avoiding the whole question indefinitely." Arthur visited the library regularly in the months that followed, no longer as a distant name on a renewal slip, but as an actual familiar presence, sitting most weeks near the display case that held his son's book, sometimes reading, sometimes simply present, the specific quiet company of a man who had finally, after 3 decades, found a way to visit his grief without needing to carry the entire weight of its preservation alone. Celia found herself looking forward to these visits, the two of them developing an easy, comfortable friendship built on the specific, unusual foundation of a bureaucratic accident that had, quite unexpectedly, revealed something genuinely significant in both their lives. "I've been thinking about something," Arthur told her, one afternoon the following spring, sitting near the display case with a cup of library coffee between them, "about all the other accounts like mine that must be sitting in your old system somewhere. Other people who've been quietly keeping something checked out for reasons the library never asked about directly." Celia considered this. "I've actually been wondering the same thing," she admitted. "I brought it up with Patricia last week. We're planning to reach out individually to any account showing more than a decade of continuous renewal before the automatic billing policy takes effect. I don't want any of them just disappearing into a form letter the way yours nearly did." Over the following months, 3 additional patrons came forward with their own long-held books. An elderly widow who had kept her late husband's favorite gardening manual checked out for 19 years after his death. A man in his 60s who had renewed a poetry collection for over a decade, unable to return the last book he and his estranged, now deceased brother had ever discussed together before their falling out. A woman who had kept a cookbook checked out for 17 years, its pages marked with her grandmother's handwritten substitutions and additions, the last connection she had to recipes her grandmother had never written down anywhere else. Each book found its way, eventually, into the library's growing memorial collection, a small, quietly expanding display that had begun, within a single year, to hold considerably more significance than the modest bureaucratic accident that had originally revealed its first occupant. On a clear afternoon nearly 2 years after Celia's first visit to his front porch, Arthur sat with her once more near the display case, the two of them having become, by that point, genuinely close friends rather than simply librarian and patron. "I think about Miles every day," Arthur said, looking at the small, worn book resting behind its protective glass. "I don't think that's ever going to change, no matter how the book itself is kept or where it sits. But I think, for 31 years, I let the fear of losing access to that physical object become tangled up with the actual grief itself, as though the book and the memory were the exact same thing, and I couldn't risk letting go of one without losing the other entirely." "Are they different?" Celia asked. "The book and the memory?" Arthur considered this for a long moment. "I think they were always different," he said finally. "I just needed 31 years, and someone finally kind enough to ask the right question, to understand that clearly enough to actually act on it. I think the memory was always going to stay with me, exactly as vivid, whether I kept renewing that book every month or not. I think what I was actually protecting all that time was my own fear of finding out whether that was true." Celia thought about her own boxes, mostly gone now, the handful of objects she'd kept displayed openly in her home rather than sealed away in a garage, and understood, sitting beside Arthur in the quiet afternoon light of a library that had, quite by accident, become a small sanctuary for exactly this kind of carefully guarded, decades-long devotion. "I think some things," she said slowly, "get held onto so tightly, for so long, because we're afraid that letting go of the object means losing the person all over again. But I think what actually happens, once you finally let go, is considerably gentler than that fear predicts. I think the person stays, just differently, somewhere a little more open, and a little less exhausting to carry." Arthur nodded slowly, looking at the small, faded lighthouse on the book's worn cover, safe now behind glass, no longer requiring anyone's monthly vigilance to remain exactly as it had always been. 31 years, he said quietly. "I think I finally understand what I was actually renewing all that time. It was never really the book. It was permission to keep loving him exactly as much as I always had, without ever needing to explain myself to anyone, until, finally, someone simply asked."